Good morning, IG Live. Glad to be here on this awesome Saturday, December 3rd, 2022, to discuss the seventh and eighth chapters of this important book. I'm grateful to come back from the Thanksgiving break. We took a week off. And good morning, Soliana. Glad to see you on this Saturday morning. We took a week off last week for Thanksgiving, and it's an interesting turn of events. Chapter 7 is titled How We Lived. Good morning, Jared. Glad to see you. Looking forward to conversing about this second to last chapter. As of next week, I'm going to be offering subscriptions, so make sure you subscribe. I'm encouraging. It'll be no more than $5.99, $5.99 to subscribe to my channel. Check that out. And waiting for Jared's request, and we'll get started. This is an interesting chapter, two chapters that we're reading. The seventh one is titled How They Lived. How They Lived. Here we go. All right. Good morning, Jared. How are you? Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see you. How was your Thanksgiving break?
It was great since we didn't celebrate it and
Oh, okay.
avoided the whole thing.
I hear you.
I avoided the whole genocide celebration.
Yes.
How was yours?
Yes. Okay. Well, like I said on my, it was always a family gathering time. Yeah, that's what they say. It's supposed to celebrate, but from my mind, it's just family being together that we haven't seen in years. So it's always so many people joining. Thank you, Kim Brown Talks, Geechee Motivator, Mad Max, 1989 is Alden. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so it was. I saw family I hadn't seen in about 4 years. So that was great.
Right.
And I saw photos of you. It looked like you were out the country.
Yeah, we were in Paris, and then we made trips to London and Geneva, and to the Pan African diaspora. We were
Awesome.
in a little for a while in a little like a Pan African diaspora getaway.
Where in Africa?
Guerrilla version of Wakanda.
Okay. Where did you go in Africa?
Well, I've been through throughout the continent, but on the trip we were just meeting with members of the diaspora who were in Paris and at the time. So that's why I'm saying it was like a little like guerrilla getaway.
I see. I see. Excellent. Paris is where the Olympics will be in 2 years, the year after next year. So as a big track star, I'm interested to speculate on who will win the different events. But yeah, Paris. I went to Paris a long time ago, about 20 years ago. But glad to know you went there.
Yeah,
Um,
in about 30 years ago, but more so as a touristy drunken sailor. This time I was more sober and targeted in my radical diaspora seeking. So,
I hear you.
but
Yeah, because it is the place for where people who we regard in the French Empire, if you will, like Frantz Fanon went to. Mad Max, Alden asked me, "You going?" I would love to. We'll see. I don't know. I don't
and
know.
as I was sharing, I went to Présence Africaine and
Oh
got
yes,
French
they
uh,
published the
of
first ones to publish
uh,
Wretched of the Earth.
And a lot of great work academically and from Jop and a lot of other
That's
scholars.
right.
Who I also got a copy of. This is what I call Jop's Federated States book.
Okay.
But it's and this is the book that Fanon wrote about the Algerian Revolution that I have unfortunately never read.
Yeah, me neither. We don't see that in the States.
But I got it in French because my daughters are learning French, so I'll
Excellent.
have to get caught up from them.
Who's translating that? Somebody needs to translate that to English.
It may
That,
have been done. I am just not aware of it. So
yeah, maybe anybody watching on this IG live could find out who. And if I mean, I studied French. I don't know to the extent to translate, but it's worth a shot. Or find somebody who can do it easily, and talk about that book, because I've never known that he wrote a book exclusively on the Algerian Revolution. There's that small part at the end of The Wretched of the Earth where he talks about Algeria, but not like a whole study of it.
and I've read, Toward an African Revolution, but this is something more targeted apparently. And again, I just one of the many, uh, voids in my reading. So
Mm.
one day.
Certainly, certainly. So this seventh chapter called by that's my grandma.
Morning.
The seventh chapter is called How They Lived, and it has an epigraph by Walter Lippmann.
Yes. And,
Um,
and I did want to say a word or two about that, about Lippmann at least. If
okay.
if
Yes,
you
go ahead.
before you moved on,
Sure.
because Lippmann, who I studied a little bit in grad school, wrote a very famous book called Public Opinion, and he's very well known in media studies, journalism studies, propaganda studies, for his discussion of the power of media to basically define for people their worlds, and to be one of the early writers of that. And in that book, and I would have to go back and it's been a while, but the way I always interpreted it, he has a where he discusses race and identity and self-defense, intellectual self-defense for whites. He basically makes the point that white people projecting a negative image of black people is essential for the self as a self-defense mechanism for white psyche and intellect. So every time I see, so it's interesting that in this epigraph that starts this chapter, which again is a theme throughout this whole book, it reads, "The rich and vulgar and pretentious Jews of our big American cities are perhaps the greatest misfortune that has ever befallen the Jewish people. They are the foundation of anti-Semitism. When they rush about in super automobiles, bejeweled and fured and painted and over-barbered, when they build themselves French chateaux and Italian palazzi, they stir up the latent hatred against crude wealth in the hands of shallow people, and that hatred diffuses itself." So when he's talking about diffusion, he's talking about the diffusion of messaging, in this case, messaging that's against Jews is perpetrated by Jews themselves who are trying to become elite whites, which I just thought was, again, filtering it through today's world, that was such a deep way to start today's conversation. And this, so anyway.
Absolutely. And to continue on that point, he says on page, Gabler writes on page 240, their extravagance, he's talking about the Hollywood Jews, had a very particular design and function beyond display. Its function was to emulate, like you said, rich Gentiles in hopes of becoming them. And it made me think of the explosion of the reality TV show, because it's that same model where artists on it, and they are artists, they are actors who are playing a role. Mona Scott Young, who produces many of the Love and Hip Hop series, kind of preach that gospel, the same gospel from Hollywood, which is I am worth what I have. What I have is equivalent to my worth. And you see that in the drama that unfolds with all the characters where life struggles to become art. Life struggles to imitate art, which is this extravagance, materialist decadence. Bobby Seale mentioned decadent culture. So absolutely, that's a theme throughout this seventh chapter. How
But
they
it's
live.
but it's part of that for me, that running theme throughout the book, which is that this particular group of elite Eastern European Jews and men particularly wanted to, they were, and as these next two chapters continued to this theme, they wanted to run from and redefine their Jewishness. They wanted to do that in part to serve a broader, more powerful, even from their own minds, need to create the world that they wanted to enter into, that world being the United States and what it meant to be in an America and an American. So even on the very next page or so, when I'm reminded, this I thought was again just a passing reference, but when Gabler's talking about um, uh, the board members, who he says were, quote, mostly of railroad presidents, bank presidents, and similar tycoons selected, so it seemed, for their complete ignorance of the motion picture industry. It reminded me that, yes, it's just like today. Jews may be the ownership, the leadership, the front of these particular industries, but they are connected to and in service to and in collegiality with other segments of non-Jewish, of other ruling elite sectors, and they have to work in concert with one another to survive and sustain and to play their respective roles. So these tycoons that he's talking about are not just Jews. They are
Right.
the ruling elite of the business and political world, who, through boards of directors more directly, and indirectly, as we're going to see later on, through sort of ethic, ideology, and even
Protestant work ethic.
and but just capitalist ethic and class ethic and race ethic, that they are trying to, this group of Jews are trying to ensconce themselves in that. Anyway, it just adds so much, I think, important context to all these discussions, and
Absolutely.
explains a lot why we see, and I know we're going to come back to this, the kind of content that we see coming out of these industries, and that it's not, as he says, just specifically, it has nothing to do with presenting Jews and Jewish history in any explanatory way, but a way of hiding Jews and Jewish history, in part to create this new American myth. I don't know. It's fascinating. Anyway.
Hiding and then not hiding at the same time, or adapting stories to allow at least one Jewish presence, as they discover, as Gabler discusses with the film Crossfire. He begins the seventh chapter talking about particularly the family unit for this group, through daughters, and how particularly he has this theme, Gabler does, of how daughters of these tycoons, these film tycoons, got married. And it was a little, it was interesting. On page 245, William Fox, he's talking about the daughters of William Fox and how their husbands were to be dismissed, to use his kid's word. Um, um, and that was interesting, that they had no use for them after they after their daughters conceived children with them. I'm talking about the husbands. They had no use for the daughters, and particularly Fox. So wow, it was just like, okay, page 256, they believe Gentiles, like you mentioned before, Jared, Wall Street was plotting their studios away. So we see this conflict, but then we see what Gabler does is the cultural defense. You know, they mount a cultural defense, which Gabler describes in depth in that 8th chapter, with groups that make sure a certain amount, or at least some amount of promotion of the ideals are put in these films. When Gabler discusses, I just want to read this comment by Giorgino 14. It seems all petty bourgeoisie peoples need to absorb enough white supremacy in order to assimilate into the power structure that is racist and misogynistic. You could absolutely say that. I'm interested in the narrative and this narrative that Gabler is writing, and how really what is inspiring this whole book discussion for me is showing how Hollywood, like a lot of things, whether we want to believe it or not, is an idea. It is a myth. But it was a myth that was believed in and empowered by several group of people with a lot of money. And just because it is a myth that has lasted a very, very, very long time doesn't mean it is absolute, or doesn't mean that it determines, doesn't mean that it is indomitable and invincible. It is an idea, Hollywood, that was created by a lot of people that is still influential today, okay? That is absolutely still influential.
Oh, more so today.
More
Uh,
so. Why
uh,
more so?
it's way more powerful today. But
Okay.
what I think is important about this book and this discussion is that for me at least, the context that explains why it was a particular group of Jews who created it, what its function was from the beginning. That function has only been enhanced through technology, more research, more involvement of the state, so on and so forth. But it explains so much without, just stopping at some vague, the Jews, kind of discussion that we're often getting now, like we or often always get. So for instance, I mean, just quickly and then I'll that again, the thread, what is so important is that it shows there is a particular logic that these founding Jews brought to bear to the creation of Hollywood, that becomes, as he discusses as World War II kicks off, becomes more aggressively politicized and perfectly sets the stage for my own narrow research and the last 50 years. So like by the time we finish this book discussion and even today's discussion, the last 50 years should be much more clear, or would be much more clearly understood, particularly the rise of the Marvel universe even, and and all of that, so for instance, but there's this class thread, for instance, that runs throughout. The tension between, as he talks about later on, and we'll come back to, the good Jews and the kite, who were supposed
Right.
to be
That was
the
described later.
ghetto, the hood Jews. It was like
The
this
clean
very
Jews.
huh?
The clean Jews
The
versus the
clean Jews
kites.
versus the kikes is what he was saying. It's like, and it's like the and again, the kikes were seen as the hood, the ghetto. They were seen by the elite Jews as and that's why they were like, we don't really want to be involved with the Hollywood and all that other kind of stuff. That's for the hood Eastern European Jews.
Yes.
Who had to be bailed out, as he starts off this chapter. Like Lasky gets wiped out in the Depression and has to get his friends, and at least one, to bail him out. But then, and I'll stop here. This for me is the crux of it, for me it's on page 314.
Okay.
Or uh, but the paragraph starts with, if Lasky had waxed suicidal, it was because he realized that in losing the trappings of his success, he had lost something much more than material comforts. For Lasky, as for nearly all the Hollywood Jews, making movies was a metaphor for one's entire life, for the imaginative transformation to which those lives would be subjected. The Hollywood Jews lived their movie. Their wealth was another way of acting out the genteel, of buying their way out of Eastern European Judaism and into America, which is to say that while they all lived well and displayed their wealth conspicuously, their extravagance had a very particular design and function beyond display. Its function was to emulate rich Gentiles in the hope of becoming them. I'm like, that to me is bars, and just says
Rich
everything
Gentiles.
about why they did what they did then, why Hollywood operates the way it does now, and why so much is unexplained in the continuing tension that plays out, unfortunately, in celebrity melodrama.
Mhm. One of the aspects of the, thank you, Jared, for that. Absolutely. There's an emulation going on. So that has to be checked when we watch it, and don't assume that our value is based on what the characters we're seeing value is. He mentions the gambling in this chapter of how they lived. Gabler writes that gambling was the inexorable demon. The most profligate was Joe Schenck. And then he talks about the different clubs, the Clover Club, the Concordia Club, social clubs. I recently finished Colton Whitehead's latest novel, Harlem Shuffle, about, the social club the main character was trying to get into. But that was definitely after what Gabler's describing here. That was in the set in the 50s, but here, um, he writes, let me see, I think this is page 259, chapter 7, opening the Clover Club in Hollywood where gambling was prohibited. It was clear that gambling was obviously going on there. And then horses, that's a big racetracks. The Belmont Stakes is what I grew up watching my father and mom go to on a regular basis. And Gabler describes Harry Warner in horses. Meyer became one of the most successful racehorse owners, Gabler writes on page 265, in the country, and one of the most important breeders. Big, and we see this. This is definitely high class culture. I don't know if you remembered. Um, there was it was Sonia Richards Ross who I saw sporting, going to the Belmont Stakes, going to, and it's a whole culture behind it. So this is part of how they live, attending races, horse races, attending the Belmont Stakes, betting on horses, seeing if you can win. I remember OTB, off track betting, that was on 233rd Street and White Plains Road in the Bronx, where my dad went to often, and just seeing a bunch of people on Saturdays in the 80s. And as I'm reading this, I realized, yes, this is part of that. Part of how they lived is by betting on horses, that whole culture.
Yeah.
Page 274, the Concordia Club having fueled into oblivion, the Jews needed a new social arbiter. Then he talks about the Hillcrest. The Hillcrest became a sanctuary for their Jewishness. And so social clubs,
But it
horse
was,
racing
what
is
was
part of
interesting to me
how they
about
live.
that is that this is again explains almost perfectly the situation of these European Jews, that they were, because they're creating these the Hillcrest and whatnot, because they were not allowed into these Gentile spots. So they were denied access to Gentile spots, but still had access enough to white supremacy and capital that they could create enough. They could create their own enclaves, and that would then exclude others and become as you were saying, these protective enclaves of Jewishness. So like in other words, when Black people constantly are encouraged to say, let's do what Jews do, this is a perfect example for me of why Black people cannot and have not ever been able to do what Jews do. So Black people could be excluded from all these clubs, but Black people did not have access to the capital and the white supremacy to get both the finances or the space to create their own, as was the case for this group of Eastern European Jews. If you're following my point.
Yes.
So like that was and that again explains for me how this group sets itself up to be in opposition to Black and other communities, because in their desire to emulate a group that is excluding them, they are excluding and behaving towards these other groups as was this Gentile group, and that again creates these points of intersection for Black and Jewish communities that remains hostile to this day. So but again, this history I think is important in filling in the gaps to explain how we got here.
Absolutely. I didn't realize when I was talking about the two different social clubs, I went from chapter 7 to chapter 8.
Right. There's a lot of, but as he says, and I highlighted the line, like to your point about the horse racing, Gabler points out that they went from Poland to polo in one generation, and they were proud of, and they were to point out this we went from Eastern European poverty to playing with the Gentiles, or playing the sport of the Gentiles in one generation. And by the way, when they mentioned that Harry Cohn was the most notorious and insatiable sexual predator, it was reminiscent of, again, ongoing problems in Hollywood and society more writ large. But anyway.
Absolutely. There's a story Gabler tells of an actress who is in Harry Cohn's office and then leaves, when he tries to make a move on her. I forget the actress's name, but that was, real when we talk about.
Dean Brooks says he remembered her father, a friend of Cohn's, recommending her for a part. Cohn seized on the idea and began inundating her with calls. So on, She was still a teenager when invited to his house, and then he grabbed for her, and she ran to the door, and then he said, "You'll never work in this town again."
He said, yeah.
So that was just one example. But
that was it. And what was the name of that actress?
Geraldine Brooks.
Okay, Geraldine Brooks. And so when we read stories like that, Gabler, the way Gabler tells us, she leaves. She doesn't go back. She doesn't leave and then go back and say, maybe we can work out a deal. She's not going to tolerate being assaulted. And she believed that she'll find another place to work without assault. And I think that's, for me, that's important for everybody to remember, that you don't have to stay in a place where you feel like you're being assaulted at all. Any other reflections on chapter 7?
No, I don't think so. I think those were it for me.
Yeah. Okay. Chapter 8 is called Rabbi to the Stars, and this is where not so much lifestyle. He talks more about the religious life. Edgar Magnin. He starts talking about Edgar Magnin in the 8th chapter. The epigraph is from an interesting novel that Gabler quotes. It's called Rabbi Burns. Consider this: a Jew becomes Americanized only in direct. I can't read backwards too.
Only in direct
proportion.
He's becoming Judaized.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's the tightrope performance, yearning to be Americanized. That is, to be accepted at par by the Goyim.
And the Goyim is the Hebrew word for Gentile.
Yeah. And it's just, again, it's the theme. this ongoing tension between remaining a Jew, remaining proud of a Jew, remaining overtly a Jew, and what that all means. And even in this thing where they talk about this rivalry between rabbis,
Right.
you know, it's various degrees of how they approach religiosity, in the sense that they even talk about one of them was so unreligious that he didn't even know how to pronounce Hanukkah. And this
Exactly.
this is like a leading rabbi, so it's like, but because there's this tension between, there's a class tension, there's this I want to be an American tension. It's fascinating.
I took the most notes I took of all the chapters. I took the most notes on this 8th chapter because it's a lot of things that get, you really see the liberalism that we discussed in our first of the series in Gabler's approach. You really see, wow, there's whole swaths of things that are not being talked about, and they have to be talked about. Like, how could you not talk about? So I'm going to just, read some quotes by Gabler's, and then, because I had, this was when my mind was really becoming, because he's going into the 30s, like you said, starting to discuss the Second World War. And so there are different factors coming in and questions that I had about, okay, he's going to talk about this because he's already talking about the religious life. So he has to talk about the pushback Stephen Wise got from American Jews about supporting Israel, but that's not talked about. And I was anticipating discussion of some material support for Hitler, which a lot of these moguls, tycoons provided. I was anticipating reading that, and I didn't read it. So I kept taking notes. What happened to...
Even I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware that they ever provided material support to Hitler.
Absolutely.
The moguls themselves?
Yes, absolutely. This is what I had showed you the book last week, not last week, but the week before, in the last IG Live we did by Thomas Doherty, called Hollywood and Hitler. And it's in his first chapter where Doherty writes, with the exception of Warner Brothers, even the studios officially out of business in Germany maintained back-channel communications. Exile Studios, again, always accepting Warner Brothers, were willing to deal with Hitler. And that's what Doherty writes in his first chapter. So in Gabler's 8th chapter, Rabbi to the Stars, he talks more about the religious life, but it's in the 30s, and I'm anticipating, okay, not every American Jew agreed with the state of Israel, and there was a big conflict between the two. That's not mentioned. It's as if, every Jew at that time believed in the creation of Israel, just like Louis Brandeis. And that's just not the case. There was a much bigger there was a much bigger difference of opinion than Gabler leads us to believe. Because according to that chapter, like, they were all on the same page, is the impression I got. American Jews were all on the same page with the construction of Israel, because it doesn't happen until 48, right? But until after the Second World War that Israel becomes a formal country. But Gabler describes the effort. It's called the Irgun, the military. He calls it a terrorist group. I was surprised he did that. The Irgun, which was the military wing trying to drive the British out to replace them with the U.S. Zionists in the 30s. And some of the filmmakers, he said, Hecht, he mentions in this chapter, Hecht. Gabler writes, Hecht raised $900 for the Irgun, which he described as a terrorist. We always have to use that in, really terrorist. Okay, what's terrorist? Then it becomes a slippery slope and everybody's a terrorist. but it was a group that did provide, you know, military armed support um, to set up Israel. And he, because he's focusing on the elite and the history of its religious, social, political construction, he doesn't talk about it in the broader context of the broader context of the debates and the opposing points of view um, that authors have read before this book do talk about Carolyn Karcher, and specifically the difference she describes between Judaism and Zionism, and the history going back to the beginning of the 20th century. So it was a very interesting chapter. Magnin, he begins with Magnin. He said, Magnin admitted, this is 280 something, 280. It was the opportunity to secularize religion. So that's what he did, serving as like a secular rabbi, because he's a rabbi, okay, to all these elites. But then you really get, yeah, he was like a he secularized the Jewish faith, made it, in my mind, palatable and commodified for the Hitler regime's consumption. Is what I was reading. While I was like, oh, okay. So he made it, you know, kind of like the product to be exported. The same way this country has exported cotton, and you see it as a product and service of to be sold to, you know, be consumed like a packaged product to sell. Um, the film was, you know, the product of the film. Um, Doherty, I want to just jump on Doherty, then stay back with Gabler. Mentions the exporting of the film all quiet on the Western Front, and how Germans, when it first premiered in Germany in the 30s, totally hated it because they were yelling Jews. And then Doherty said somebody had released rats in the theater, you know, to really underscore the point of we should not support this film because Jews supported it. The real anti-Semitism also in Germany, because that film was done by, I forget which Hollywood studio that Gabler mentions. But all that to say, Hollywood in the 30s needed the rabbis to help them justify the export, what would become a commodity to export, you know, the film. Um, yeah. And then he
Yeah,
mentioned
I'm,
that's
I'm maybe we read this very differently,
okay.
or maybe I'm just misunderstanding it. So first, I have not read the Doherty book, but what I remember is that, so first, Hitler was seen by the entire American government and business community as a good guy up until very late.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
so I'm not aware of this, but to the point that you're saying that Doherty makes, that Jews would have been supporting, Hollywood Jews would have been supporting him, is not, would be logical from the standpoint that they were not trying to upset American business interests, and they
Right,
were
absolutely.
in producing films critical of Hitler, even as he became more aggressive and more powerful, and as the killing of Jews started to ramp up. And that's a little bit kind of discussed in Gabler, in the sense that he talks a lot about how Jews were conflicted in terms of wanting to protect their anonymity and not being the focus, and how the Jews who ran Hollywood were themselves saying Hollywood is run by Jews, but it's not to tell Jewish stories, and it's not to put Jews on camera. So that even talks about how Jewish actors suffered as a result of Jews running Hollywood, not wanting Jews to be the center of attention. So, but but as I'm reading what he's saying, that is Gabler about the rabbis, I'm definitely not getting the point you're making about the export of these films into Germany. What I'm getting is that these rabbis were instrumental in providing for the Jews in Hollywood a way to stay connected to their Judaism in a way that was
Yes.
comfortable for them. So he was becoming like, Mangan becomes like that first celebrity preacher or whatever.
Yes.
That, you know, like for Jews at least, like that's becomes like that kind of, you know, the way we see, you know, celebrities today latch on to one or another religious figure. Like that's what he was for them, like a way for them to stay in Hollywood but stay somewhat connected to their religion to the extent they wanted to. And that's why many of them found it possible, because he was doing it in some really unreligious, secular, celebrity style way. So he was
Celebrity
like,
style.
you can still get your fancy on and do your thing and have your Gentile wives and do all of that. We're not going to do an orthodoxy and all of that other kind of stuff. You know, we're going to make it easy. So yeah. So anyway, in terms of making it palatable for export into Germany, I didn't get that part from.
Yeah, I was thinking about that
Okay.
because I know this is happening at the same time. How does Hitler become so influential? You know, they don't have a lot of what they need, so that's what's going on in my mind. Like I said, I was waiting for the mention of the export of the film, but as I realized, like you
But
said, this is a
Hitler.
focus on the rabbis.
But again, I'm not aware that, like, Hitler had his own propaganda machine. They had their
Mhm.
own method and their own political climate that allowed him to come to power, that I don't think relied on American Hollywood per se as much as it relied on similar tactics of propagating. I mean, they had their own film industry. Jews were in that film industry, and Jews even, you know, participated in producing anti-Jew content in Germany, to maintain their connection to that industry as long as they could. So that's why I keep coming back to this whole thing of that Gabler, I think, helps clarify that yes, Jews may be running the industry, but that does not mean that they're running it in terms of its content strictly for Jews. In fact, they're running it for a broader political apparatus that requires satisfying a lot of Gentiles and others, which is why they end up parroting the very anti-Black messaging, so on and so forth. So like, I even thought, and I can't remember which chapter it was in, but when he's talking about Gabler, is even the whole part about, I thought it was in that film Crossfire, that they had to
Right.
change the film because it was
From a
around
um,
a gay
main
character,
character to a Jew.
and then they changed it to a Jew, and then one of the moguls, one of the Jewish moguls, had at one point said, "I don't even want it to be a Jew. Let's make him black."
Yes.
They were like, you know.
Anything to separate themselves from Jewish identity.
But I think more important for me, at least, was that it reminds us that yes, again, Jews may have been positioned to run this industry, but they're not. Again, they have to appease other interests.
Right.
You know, so like,
Yes.
if they have to sacrifice a gay character, cool. If they have to sacrifice a Black character, cool. If they have to sacrifice Jews, cool. But the goal is satisfying that audience in that political apparatus that I think Gabler keeps showing that tension of throughout these two chapters. But anyway, that's, you know.
To your point, on page 284, Gabler writes, making movies was a deeper obligation than religion. The new Wilshire Boulevard Temple was designed after the Pantheon in Rome. Um, yeah.
And he talks about how much they were like admirers of Catholicism.
Yes, definitely.
Which I thought was interesting. They were trying to mimic the relationship of the Catholic priest and the politics of Catholicism, which made me think of, I don't know if you've heard, there's this documentary I used to use called "This Film Is Not Yet Rated," And it's a
No.
documentary about the film industry from the early 2000s, maybe, about the corporate organization of the industry and how ratings are the politics behind ratings. That films are rated, and the way it's determined through the Motion Pictures Association of America, which is an organization of the studios that used to work, at least, and maybe still does, in anonymity in terms of who sat on that board and determined the ratings of these films. Which,
Erica Keynes just joined us. Hi, morning, Erica.
peace, peace, peace.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who sit on the boards, to these ratings are, as this film exposes, were mostly, were almost, I think, were all white, all well over middle age, all of a certain class, and they're the ones determining whether a film was an R or an NR, which was the new X rating. And if you get a not rateable or not rated or an X rating, that means you don't get into theaters, and that ruins the release of your film. If you get an R rating, but you wanted a PG-13, that cuts down your audience, that reduces, so there's a whole politics behind this. And the reason I bring this up is that what was revealed in this documentary was that on this board of rating, this ratings board, sits an anonymous Catholic priest. And I always used to wonder, like, and they could identify what it was, and I haven't followed up since, so maybe it's been exposed, but like, what is a Catholic priest doing sitting quietly on this ratings board? And how did the Catholic priest get to be the one situated there, given what we often hear about Jews and everyone else? Like, what is, so when I read this, I was thinking, maybe this is the seed of that answer. That these Hollywood Jews had a particular affinity for Catholicism for whatever reason, that I don't think Gabler really explains very well in his chapters, but I thought was interesting. Anyway, so sorry.
Definitely.
For that, but yeah.
Lingon Berry Jamster asks, is that similar to the Utah Mormon production studios? The Osmond singers had a huge religious capitalist system, as did the Jacksons with Jehovah's Witness religion.
Well, I don't know. What I'm simply saying is it's odd, and that the ratings of films that we all want to go see, or we're all told to go see, are being determined by this shadowy group that includes this Catholic priest, or at least used to. I'm a little outdated here with my research, or my reference, but I don't know. And then similarly, like Gabler talks about in this book, the fascination with Catholicism and with Christian Scientology.
Absolutely.
Again, maybe starting to fill in some gaps as to why Scientology is still around and why many actors are involved in it, and what this affinity is. That I don't think Gabler really fully explores. But I'm like, what
the theology behind it? He mentions Gabler mentions Christian Science on page 286. There was a convenient way station from the faith of their fathers to complete acculturation in America. Christian Science. And that's still
about it didn't
going
mean
on
that they
today.
had to fully give up their Jewishness to be in it. Somewhere in there, he mentioned something like that. And
yeah, are you familiar with the theological arguments against Christian Science, Jared? Because I hear them so often as a Christian.
I'm familiar with the science-based critique of the science fiction mythology behind Christian Science.
Yes. Well, theologically, as a Christian, it's so materialistic. Like, in order to be part of it, you have to give so much of your money, and in doing so, you're giving them, kind of like the Catholic Church or any other religious group, control. So they always struck me as a solidly materialistic faith that many, Gabler writes, joined. Many individuals in this group that he describes joined. A very influential group.
I don't know. It's hard for me to look at the apparatus of any of these religions and not see a material base. I mean, I see a lot of big churches. I see a lot of big mosques. I see a lot of big synagogues. I see a lot of money and a lot of So I don't know that Scientology is more material based than any other.
Than any other, right?
But I find its theology more of a stretch maybe than any other, and I find it hard to understand how someone could be a believer in Judaism or Christianity and follow Scientology. But look, all I'm saying is, in terms of today's conversation, is that I thought his mention of both their interest in Catholicism, which he says also was related to as he describes, the august sort of pageantry, the magisterial nature of Catholicism was endearing to them, to these Jews. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting that he mentions their interest in this, which I didn't remember, but does certainly maybe speak to what's going on now.
Ricky Ryan says California has the second largest population of Mormons outside of Utah. So that would explain. I don't know if Mormonism had to have come before what we're reading here in the 30s of this Christian Science.
Well, Mormonism predates Scientology, because Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard don't come around until the 50s, 60s, whatever.
I see.
And he brings a very science fiction storytelling to that belief system, from my humble viewpoint. But anyway, but without getting too much into that, like, I don't, that could be, days longs of side stuff, or tributaries. But what there was 2 points that I wanted to come back to quickly that you mentioned, that Gabler does talk about in passing. One is this issue of the world wars and the relationship to the Nazis, and this tension that Jews felt of even as things are getting worse, like, we don't want to be at the forefront of waving the flag against Hitler until it becomes acceptable after the war, is basically when he starts pointing to movies in like 47 and whatnot, that are looking back, praising the war effort against Hitler, and then looking to recast the image of Jews and their relationship to society. So then, for instance, to your other point, that when the issue of Israel and Palestine comes up, first, I like that Gabler is forced to be accurate in describing that region as Palestine.
Me too.
In 1940, whatever. But then he's always talking about Jews in Palestine and or whatever. But then he says here, let's see, talking about Selznick. Selznick paid up, and eventually other top Hollywood Jews, browbeaten by the Nazi atrocities then going on in Europe, agreed to attend a meeting in the commissary at 20th Century Fox. But when one of the speakers, a British colonel who had commanded a group of Jewish soldiers during World War I, excoriated the British for their behavior in Palestine, the Hollywood Jews, most of whom were Anglophiles, were unsettled.
That's right.
My point here is that this is again in the context of Jewish leaders in Hollywood trying to organize how Jews would be depicted, how much noise would be made about how Jews were depicted, and then how Hollywood would be a propaganda. He even uses that word, propaganda machine, for various interests. I thought it was fascinating that when even a Jewish leader, to your point about the tension Gabler ignores, when Jewish leadership says, what are we doing to the Palestinians? The Hollywood Jews, because as he says, were Anglophiles, meaning now supporting the British, the Western way, all of that. They were like, I don't want to be, don't.
But they still gave money, even though they said they didn't want to.
No, I'm not. My point though is that they were saying, I don't want to get involved with the critique of Israel. That was the
Right.
point. Like
Definitely.
even as fellow Jews were saying, what is this Israeli project really all about? This
Yes.
group of Jews was like, nah, because we're on Team Anglophile. We're on Team
Absolutely.
West.
We're in the U.S.
And we're down with the Western project, which includes Zionism and the support for Israel. But
Definitely.
but again, my only point is that when Jews in Hollywood are reduced to just being Jews who run Hollywood, we lose sight of the class and the politics and
Definitely.
the broader context that is described here in Gabler, whereas as you even brought up earlier, where Jews who are even trying to be critical of it are themselves run over.
Absolutely.
So anyway.
That is very prominent. I mean, you see that among, as if, as if Rabbi Stephen Wise represent, because he mentions Adolf Zukor. Adolf Zukor on page 285, Gabler writes, enrolled his children in Rabbi Stephen Wise's Free Synagogue. Not every American Jew at this time abided by Stephen Wise and Louis Brandeis, So that class issue, with the money they quote unquote earned from the film industry, they are, securing their enclave that they already have in the US. Now they're securing it in the Middle East by displacing other European colonizers, the way that the English displaced the Spanish in Jamaica. And now these American Jews are trying to displace the British in what they call Israel, but what Gabler rightfully calls Palestine.
Well, as I read it, it was the Israel isn't created until you get that British, the Balfour Declaration.
That's right.
Right. So, but and I'm thinking now of Norman Finkelstein's work.
Okay.
It's not until the mid 60s that the United States itself really gets behind supporting Israel after they win that 67 war.
Right.
And prove themselves valuable to the imperial project. That's when Finkelstein says the U.S. gets fully involved. So at this point that Gabler's talking about, that's why as I read him saying these Jews were Anglophiles, he was saying they're on Team British right now. They're which is an American ally, but the U.S. isn't really fully committed to Israel yet. So right now they're saying they're like Anglophiles, so they're like. I know the U.S. isn't fully Israel yet, but the British are, and we know that none of them are on the Palestinian side. So when even one of our fellow Jews starts raising a hand saying, "What about these Palestinians?" We're like, "Nah, we're unsettled."
That's right. Yeah. We don't know about anything unless we know for sure there's, like you said, profitable. They've been subdued, if you will, the way the current president of Ukraine is definitely on U.S. side. There's no question, unless we know that whoever we have there is on our side, has made a deal, to use Trump's words. We've made the deal with them to the point where they're unapologetically on our quote unquote side. I'm glad you mentioned David Selznick because wow, so many good comments here. I want to mention a quote, Gabler's quote of Selznick, because he was the example Gabler gave of Jews not wanting, like you said, to touch Palestine or to support the Irgun. Gabler quotes Selznick, "It would be silly of me," on page 290 for me, in the print copy I have, "It would be silly of me to pretend suddenly that I'm a Jew, declining to support Hecht's Irgun cause." And so he still got the money. Gabler doesn't tell us exactly where, but they got the money, which would lead, of course, to the creation of Israel in 1948. But Gabler makes clear they weren't public supporters. They weren't proclaiming their support for the military cause in Palestine to the world.
But again, maybe I got to read this more carefully, and I'm not clear enough on the history. That's very possible. But what I was reading, it was that they were hesitant to support the Irgun, which I agree with you. I'm impressed that Gabler acknowledges them as a terrorist group, because that's what they were. They were there to terrorize the Palestinians out of Palestine, out of their own homeland. But that the Jews in Hollywood were hesitant to support them because they were also anti-British. The Irgun was anti-British in the sense that the British weren't doing enough to get rid of the Palestinians and make this safe for the Jews.
Yes.
So if you are, again, the Hollywood Jews, as Gabler is calling them, is, I think, doing us a service. Is helpful.
Yes.
And if in no other way, in showing us this thread, the needle they're trying to thread, or whatever, this group of Hollywood Jews, in trying to get away from being Jews while supporting Jews, while not overtly supporting Jews, while building this American mythology and what it means to be white and American, while supporting the British, but not supporting, not supporting the most militant Jews in terms of this Irgun group. They're like, and then in one of the quotes I want to come back to before he wraps, trying to argue over what level or what form of propaganda can Hollywood be used for, because we know it works.
Yes.
But then it's just a question of whose message is going to be dominant, and which message in terms of Jews do we want to support. So I think it's fascinating. Like, it's not just so simple. They're trying to. So anyway, that's how I read the whole thing with the Irgun. Then they're struggling to support that because they're like, well, they're really against the British, even as they claim to be for the Jews. But we got to be for the Brits even before we who are Jews are for the Jews, because we're trying to get away from them and get in this lane. Because as I've always started with, and I'll end here, what European Jews know very clearly, when Jews step into the light, it's the white folks that get violent and aggressive and hostile. So that's why they're like, I'm not going to upset the Brits. You know what I mean? I may not agree with what we're doing to the Palestinians, but I'm not upsetting the Brits, because when white folks get mad, that's when the machines start turning on. And we needed the Brits to get the machines turned off in Germany. We need to, we need this lane to work, is what, and then the Jews over here in the United States are saying, we're not even trying to be, we're trying to disappear into American aristocracy. And anyway, I'll stop there. My bad.
No problem. Please. I'm reading this comment from Ricky Ryan. Not blatantly, she and Lingonberry Jamster are having a conversation about the Muslim beliefs, Muslim scholars, as well as Nollywood, Nigerian Hollywood. And so Ricky asks, or she says, not blatantly, many of the films are religious, Christian based, but that's a subsection of the Nollywood industry, like rom-coms. And then Lingonberry Jamster says, I'm a bit of a sucker for Nollywood rom-coms, romantic comedies. Oh yeah. I saw them when I was getting my hair twisted in the shop on Georgia Avenue, run by the Senegalese women. They have on the TVs in their store the Nollywood films, the rom-coms, romantic comedies. And
then why did a former Igbo friend of mine once describe to me, she said to me, we Igbo are considered the Jews of Nigeria. And I never fully followed that up. I don't know the details, so I don't know how that even plays, if it's even relevant here. But I've always been interested in that and have never fully followed up on why she made that point. So when I hear you describing what's being said, and I can't really see the comments in this the way the phone is set up, but I can only see them in quick, I don't know, faded, passing, whatever. But yeah. So I don't know, I don't know enough about how Nollywood is set up, but it all similar to what's happening in terms of what we're reading.
Right.
Is a political thread that even a group that might be even majority Muslim might have to to
When it goes back to ultimately recognizing Anglo supremacy by this group,
Yep.
and showing just tips or bits of one's faith, but the faith is still there. Gabler goes from describing Magnin, who was like the rabbi, to Silberberg. Um, Gabler on page 294 says Silberberg was the Rabbi Magnin of the secular Jewish community. So where Magnin was inside the group of Hollywood Jews, Silberberg was outside. Um, and then he goes on to talk about Silberberg. He says
But
Hollywood, go
yeah,
ahead.
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
He says Hollywood itself was a means of avoiding Judaism, not celebrating it. And then here's where he mentions the big film that I wanted to see, but I just, instead of watching it, I chose to read the Wikipedia of it. And that film is Citizen Kane,
Mm,
um, which I became interested in the way Gabler writes it, because it was based on the experience of William Randolph Hearst.
mm,
And one of the things about Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World, that I remember him writing, and that always stayed with me, it was a 1920 article for Negro World where Garvey says, "Do not follow the dictates of William Randolph Hearst." And he's saying this in 1920. And then I'm reading in Gabler's book about the film Citizen Kane, based on um, William Randolph Hearst, and how the whole story of it was based on Kane. Kane was the big newspaper tycoon, like based off of the real life Hearst, and how he said Rosebud at the beginning of the film, and the whole film is the story of the reporter trying to find out, what does Rosebud mean, and nobody knows.
mm.
But I was wanting Gabler to describe the moral of. I was wanting Gabler to describe the moral of Citizen Kane the way he described the jazz singer,
Mm.
and that is that mainstream America, including Hearst himself, misses the most important things when studying a person's life. Misses those powerful human relationships, as opposed to the strive for personal career. And I wanted him to, oh, please tell me more about Citizen Kane, but he didn't get to. He talked about the film
'Cause
Crossfire.
that's what that was what
Yeah.
he spent more time on.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen Citizen Kane.
Yeah, it was popular.
I know it's famous, but I don't think I'm just trying to struggle to, as you were talking about it, what do I remember from it? And I don't think I remember anything beyond what maybe were clips in other films or documentaries.
Mhm.
So anyway, but I liked about just quickly, one thing about Silberberg,
Mhm.
just to the point that I keep being focused on, at least, is that he says, at one point, and for me it's on page 399, but he says, when he was talking about the conflict among elite Jews and who would determine how the industry would be used to shape, or as he says, influence public opinion. Silberberg, in complaining about the Jews who were running Hollywood, says, quote, "They are also deeply engrossed in various kinds of war and industry related activities that they do not have the necessary interest. But because their focus seems to have been mostly on an interest in programs that, quote, promote ideals of sound Americanism, to oppose fascism, to advance democratic thinking in respect to the international scene." And I say it that way and quoted these two passages in the order I did, because to me, the way he orders it, that is Silberberg has quoted by Gabler, is that sound Americanism is first, then in opposition to fascism, as long as it comports to whatever is seen as soundly
Sound
American.
Americanism. Mhm. And I
Then,
think
so
Warner,
that's that. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah,
the
that was.
Warner studio, I think Gabler makes the case, was of all the studios most stringent to promoting that value system, the
Mm-hmm.
sound Americanism. Um, and as I say, Warner, I remember Gabler's point in the previous chapter about Zukor's son, Zukor of Paramount, recalling a fight between Zukor and Warner about the Gary Cooper film. And when
Mm-hmm.
I saw the word Gary Cooper, the name, I remember James Baldwin speaking at the Oxford debate, mentioning Gary Cooper and growing up watching the films from Warner with Gary Cooper and saying that I thought I was Gary Cooper, something to the effect of I thought I was Gary Cooper, but when I grew up, I realized I was the Indian that Gary
Yeah.
Cooper was fighting. But
Right.
to your point, the Warner Studio really promoted these sound American ideals. Ricky Ryan just said, Sister, Sister is on YouTube, written by Maya Angelou, starring Diane Carroll, Rosalind Cash, and Irene Cara. Irene Cara, wow, who
Rest.
just passed since we last talked, Jared. I
Yeah.
just want to say, she carried a very strong emotional space for me.
Mm.
It was an emotional space that wasn't just, it was filled with dignity, but also sexuality, and also dignity and sexuality. I was forever changed watching her in Roots: The Next Generation. That was an amazing performance. I usually don't get affected by film actresses. I was affected by Irene Cara. When she cried, I cried. Nobody has had that effect on me.
Mm.
So I thank, yeah, nobody but Irene Cara. And then I found out her background. I believe her father is Cuban and her mother is Puerto Rican. But I was just, it was this inexplicable um, sympathy that I had for her character, who was Bertha Haley in the Roots series, which ends up being Alex Haley's grandmother. Yeah, because all of Roots is based on Alex Haley's lineage. So thank you, Ricky, for mentioning Irene Cara, who was a strong film presence, um, um, who was blackballed in the 80s because she refused to allow um, certain producers to exploit her.
Mm.
And so her work and her activism behind the camera is an example to all of us. Yeah. That's right. Thanks. That tracks. Ricky's Erica says, I grew up watching Turner Classic and American Movie Classic channels with my aunt, and Warner Brothers was really heavy-handed. Yes, yes, heavy-handed. And yeah, because that's what Gabler says. And it was out of the Warner Studios we got Gary Cooper films. Um,
So, just very quickly,
mhm.
I can't help but see some of these parallel threads here because the Netherlands have just gone up 1-0 on the United States in the World Cup, and the goal scored by Memphis Depay, one of the Netherlands' African descended captives, and it
All
reminds
right, Netherlands, Amsterdam.
the United States, who this World Cup has more foreign-born nationals on it than ever. I'm just reminded that in going down early to the Netherlands, that the United States, for all of its experience in enslavement and colonialism, is still a baby compared to the Dutch. So the Dutch are demonstrating our lineage into Africa and theft is longer than yours, and we can better put our descended Africans to use than you can, and that's why they're winning 1-0. So that's my Pan-African interpretation and analysis of what's happening in sports right now.
I mean, when you think about all these athletes running for the European countries who were born in other countries, absolutely.
Including the right back or left back for the United States is Serginho Dest, who was born in the Netherlands. So an African descended, got some black blood in there somewhere,
Yes.
and was born in it. So there's all kinds of overlap. But anyway. But I did want to come back because I didn't want to you mentioned that they talk about the film Crossfire, and I didn't want
Yes.
to cite that because to me that it was among one of the more revealing parts of the book, or this chapter, in terms of, again, this narrow focus of my own, as he writes on For What Is Me, page 400, that Gabler, since Hollywood promulgated the image of the Jew to most Americans, and since Jews controlled Hollywood, why couldn't they be coaxed into presenting a more positive image of their own people? Prior to World War II, the question of Jewish identity on the screen was never very significant because Jews were very seldom seen. Jews are for killing, one Jewish studio executive of the 30s was reported to have said, not for making movies about. Years later, when writer Garson Kenin suggested Judy Holliday, a Jewess, for the lead in Born Yesterday, the producer, also a Jew, told him, this show is by Jews and for Jews, but it can't be with Jews. She was hired anyway, Gabler writes. Some Jews, he says on the next page, some Hollywood Jews admitted that they deliberately avoided Jewish subjects because they didn't want to ruffle the goyim. Rabbis don't look dramatic. A priest has all the trimmings and all this stuff as to why you see priests as opposed to rabbis in film was part of the, beneath the lame excuses, Gabler continues, this was the deeper truth. Hollywood was itself a means of avoiding Judaism, not celebrating it. So he just goes, and then he goes on to talk about all the Jews who changed their names to get rid of their so Edward G. Robinson kept the G to remind him of his Goldenberg original last name and stuff like that. So again, my point is that what is a fascination to me is that this tension among Jews in Hollywood was to control Hollywood for their own propaganda purposes, but which were primarily for producing an American mythology that white America would be comfortable with, so that when it comes to this film, the specific discussion of Crossfire, when they're trying to decide, well, if the main character is seen to be gay, is supposed to be gay in the initial writing, well, why don't we, now that we need to make Jews, we need a moment of showing a positive depiction of Jews, why don't we make him a Jew? And then, one of and even the way Gabler writes it, he's like, it's dismissive. The guy says, no, make him black. It's not, and it's not in some like let's help black people look better. It's a way of saying, let's get the focus off of us and present, as I would read it, blackness in a very comfortable form.
Comfortable for the owners.
For the owners, not for black people.
Right.
But even in a discussion of Jews or gays, the point is we have to present each of these characters in ways that we find acceptable and that the Goyim will find acceptable. And I think that is something that is instructive going in, even into today as we understand how things work. So now again, Gabler, to your point about things he does not follow up on, he doesn't follow that thread of what does it mean to have various identities thrown in to be made a hero or a villain. What does it mean? As he says here, Rothschild immediately contacted Sherry to dissuade him from making the film about Jews. With astounding insensitivity, he suggested making the victim a black instead. So the victim who overcomes the whatever, instead of making him, identifiably gay and therefore sympathetic, we don't want to make him a Jew because we don't want Jews to have this undue attention. So let's just make it, black.
Absolutely. Anyway. And I wanted to say that Gabler ends the 8th chapter talking about just the infrastructure that would do what you just described, Jared. Just make sure that there was no extra attention to Jewish heritage or identity in a lot of the films. These groups kind of were set up to do that. An umbrella group of Jewish organizations, the National Community Relations Advisory Council, Gabler describes, and these groups,
the AJC, the ADL, there was like a whole bunch. There was like a whole little alphabet soup of groups that were forming, and with a specific focus on what films would do. So this is again sort of my point about today. Gabler,
this explains the group that attacked Kyrie Irving of anti-Semitism.
oh, the ADL has a long history, and in fact, I'm waiting for another video piece that I contributed some part to that will talk about the ADL and its history vis-a-vis Black people to come out, and I'll hopefully be sharing that around, because the ADL has a long history of being a conservative, white supremacist, colonialist representative of elite Jews who have worked with the federal government in a variety of ways to suppress all forms of radicalism among Jews, among Black and Arab and Muslim groups, and for a long, long time. So before they picked up on this 40-year exchange with Farrakhan, before they picked up on Kyrie and Kanye, they have been woefully involved in politics and discussions, for a long time. And as I've continued to say, and I'll just stop here with this part, but I think the ADL plays a very conservative role in propping up conservative Black politics as well by giving legitimacy too. So, but that's what he's talking about. But the point that Gabler is getting at, though, and that the ADL would have to acknowledge itself and all these other groups, that they were all competing with each other for who would have the most influence over what they all recognized and agreed was a very powerful public opinion shaping propaganda tool, that is the film industry. So when conservative Jews, particularly those like the ADL, want to complain about critics of Hollywood raising complaints about how Hollywood depicts their group or their politics, no one should be confused or dismissive with claims of anti-Semitism, et cetera, and so forth, because as Gabler points out here, from the very beginning, all variety of Jews, politically, et cetera, have been vying for control over this powerful propaganda arm that does work in service of broader politics and is recognized as being powerful in that regard. So the question shouldn't be, again, do Jews run Hollywood? The question should be, which class of Jews and for what political purpose? And as Gabler points out here, how did they get there and why? That should be the discussion, not, but the ADL and others would prefer, as I think Gabler helps us understand why. Let's keep it about protecting Zionism. Let's keep it about protecting a white American fantasy. Let's keep it about protecting against radical politics and other minority groups that might become threatening. That's what we're here for. That's from their perspective. I think Gabler helps make clear from their perspective. That's what they're saying. That's what we're here for. So we're not going to stand for whether it's Farrakhan, Kyrie, Kanye, or someone more substantively critical of what's happening. We're not going to stand for it from any of you.
Absolutely. He finishes this chapter talking about Nussbaum, a more thoughtful and refined progressive rabbi than Magnin. Nussbaum, who helps, like you said, vet and present the respectable Hollywood image for the films.
But he's also described as that liberal that you talked about too. Like he walked out when a Black colleague couldn't go into a place with him. Nussbaum, it says, walked out. Like quietly, he said, escorted his group out so that they would be in solidarity with this Black person that was barred from entrance. But there's no further discussion in terms of, so it says, but when Robinson, a Black, was refused service, Nussbaum calmly shepherded the group out. So you know, in what way does this become emblematic of the very liberal engagement of a certain class in ideology of Jews who see themselves as playing some, you know, radical role vis-a-vis Black struggle, but maybe only go so far as you know, polite liberal solidarity. Like, I don't know how far did Nussbaum go? Was
Yeah,
that the extent of his allyship, or was that just the beginning?
we'll see. I don't know. So next week will be our last week. I want to thank you, Jared, for this awesome discussion that will culminate in last week's last discussion on this book. It's an amazing book. Um, it's an important book to read, I believe, especially with all these accusations of anti-Semitism, to know, um, for a young person, you know, what does Judaism mean? What did Judaism mean to a group of influential men who created the idea of Hollywood? Let's keep in mind it's an idea, and it should not be a master in one's mind. So next week we're scheduled to read chapters 9 and 10, and that will be the last one.
And might as well add the epilogue, right? There's an
And the
epilogue.
epilogue, yes, I do want to read, you know, what he thinks, and I'm going to really do my best to read reviews of Gabler's book and see, you know, which. Good morning, Renee McBride Williams of Philly. Christian McBride's mother joins us now, and yes, so we should read the epilogue to just see also Gabler's reflection on his research and the way that the industry has changed since he wrote it. So yes, absolutely. Please join us then.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look forward to it. See you all next week.
That's right. See you next week. Bye.